Hi everyone, welcome to another video tutorial on how to enable role-based access control RBAC with API Gateway and OPA, Open Policy Agent. My name is Babur and I am a developer advocate for Apache APISIX. In this video, we'll discuss how to enable role-based access control authorization model for your APIs with open source API gateway like Apache APISIX and Open Policy Agent. We'll create upstream, route, and enable OPA plugin of APISIX, and you read the user role and permissions. Role-based access control and attribute-based access control are two commonly used access control models used to manage permissions and control the access to resources in your system. RBAC, for example, assigns permissions to users based on their role within an organization or an API. In RBAC, roles are defined based on the functions and responsibility of users, and permissions are assigned to those roles. OPA, Open Policy Agent, is a policy engine and set of tools that provide a unified approach to policy enforcement across entire distributed systems. It allows you to define, manage, and enforce policies centrally from a single point. By defining the policies as a code, OPA perhaps enables easy to review, edit, and roll back of created policies, and facilitating efficient policy management. OPA provides a declarative language called RIGO, which allows you to create and enforce policies throughout your stack. When you request a policy decision from OPA, it uses the rules and data that you have provided in a RIGO file to evaluate the query and produce a response. The query result is then sent back to you as a policy decision to your API, and OPA stores all the policies and data it needs inside its memory cache. As a result, OPA returns the results quickly. And here's an example of simple OPA RIGO file. In this example, we have a package called example that defines a rule called allow. The allow rule specifies the request is allowed if the input method is HTTP GET request, which we are requesting the path/API/resource, and the user's role is admin. If these conditions only met, then OPA allows to proceed this request by changing the allow attribute to true. In Apache APISIX, you can configure routes and plugins to define the behavior of your API. You can use APISIX OPA plugin to enforce RBAC policies by forwarding requests to OPA for decision making. Then OPA makes authorization decision based on the user roles and permissions in real time. For example, as you can see in the diagram, API consumer first requests a route on the API gateway with its credentials such as JWT token in the authorization header. Then API gateway sends the consumer data with this header to the OPA engine, and OPA evaluates if the consumer has a right to access the resource by using policies like roles and permissions we specified in the RIGO file. If the OPA decision is allowed, then the request will be forwarded to the upstream service. Assume that we have a conference API where you can retrieve, edit, event, sessions, topics, and speaker information. And the speaker can only read their own sessions and topics, while the conference admin can edit and add more sessions and topics for all the speakers. Or attendees can leave their feedback about speaker sessions via post request to the /feedback, right? And the speaker can only see by requesting this get method of the same URI. In this demo, we are going to use this conference API as our backend service with a set of resources, and we are going to apply RBAC to open resources or closed resources based on roles and permissions. With enough theoretical knowledge in mind, now we can jump into practical session. We can also find step-by-step instructions on how to install, configure APISIX, enable some plugins, define policies in OPA series, also some simple curl commands you can find on the blog post. The link I am providing on the video description. Some of the prerequisites to run this sample: you need to have a Docker installed. In my case, I am using Windows operating system, and as you can see, Docker desktop installed on my machine. The next, we're gonna use curl commands to send requests to APISIX admin API. You can also use easily tools such as Postman to interact with the API. Or if you want to achieve all the steps using user-friendly dashboard, you can use open source community developed dashboard for creating route, upstream, or enabling the plugins, also working with the OPA service. If it's not sufficient enough, you can also choose Enterprise API 7, which is built on the top of APISIX. It provides a lot of built-in features, advanced features that APISIX dashboard doesn't offer. So let's get started. Now, the first step to install APISIX. To install APISIX, you can run quick start script, which will run two containers, one APISIX and another etcd, which is storage for APISIX. As you can see, these two containers up and running. So this is step number one. Step number two, I'm going to create a backend service to route our request to the this conference API. So we need to configure it by adding upstream with unique upstream ID. So the admin API of Apache APISIX. So in this case we have a single node, and we're using HTTPS security scheme. And once we run this curl command on the terminal, you will get successful response from APISIX. So we have now a single route for our conference API is created. Step number three, we need to create our first API consumer. So let's say username, call it Yak, and it's and we're also going to set up a JWT plugin for this consumer. It means we are only allowing to access our API for the authenticated users. We're using JSON web tokens. We can run this curl command to create our first consumer with its credentials. If you run, click this command, APISIX responds again OK, which means everything is fine. So next, step number four, we need to create a public endpoint to generate a JWT token, because in our case the API gateway itself acts as identity provider, but you can also use other identity providers which are third-party services such as Google, Okta, Kikulog, or Hydra. So if you want to have APISIX also play the identity provider role, you need to create a virtual public endpoint with a given URI, which generates a token and signs this token. So I will run this command. In this case, I created a new route with a JWT signing token endpoint. Next step is I can try to now claim new JWT token by create a new JWT endpoint, and I will also provide some payload with a speaker role and permission. And on the later stage, we can read the role and permission from this token itself. If you run this curl command, you need to get a new active JWT token. As you can see, after I run this curl command, I got it from APISIX new generated JWT token I can use to access my APIs. It means I can save somewhere here, because I will use soon this generated JWT token. Next step is I need to create a new plugin configuration, which means I need to enable for the route level JW2 plugin, and also I'm using the proxy rewrite plugin. It's configured to proxy our requests to the conference API host name, and also we up to now enabled only JW2 plugin for consumer level. We need to also specify for the route level. For this, let's first create our plugin config, where this plugin config can be reused for one or more routes. If I run this command, everything is okay. Now we have done step number 6. Step number 7, I need to create actual route for routing my conference endpoint calls to the actual conference API URIs. For example, as you can see, this JSON payload contains information about the route, such as it has a name, a description, and methods to match these requests. If any requests get or post coming to the any either topics or sessions, these requests will be forwarded to upstream we created in the previous steps. And also it will use above plugins by the plugin config unique ID. As you can see here, we created the plugin config and we are referring to this plugin config in the admin route configuration. I will run this command to create my next route. It's actually main route that routes our request to the intended destination. So far, we don't have any OPA registered. We are only using accessing our API gateway endpoint by using token, and we don't have any policies yet, which means API gateway always accepts JWT token in the authorization header when we try to hit /speaker by speaker ID and to retrieve speaker's topics. We need to always provide the JW2 token, otherwise our request will be rejected. So far what we achieved these steps. Now, as you can see, if I'm providing valid JWT token, I'm able to access my conference API. If we are not using any authentication, at API gateway level is actually endpoint is open to everyone, right? Now, next step. Now let's try to introduce here open policy agent service. If we run another Docker command to bring the container of the OPA image with the latest version, and it creates a container on existing APISIX network. Make sure that OPA and APISIX should run in the same Docker network. So, and OPA service exposes by this endpoint, this port 8181, and if you click and bring this command to the terminal and run this Docker command, it will spin up a new Docker container. And I can check even on my Docker desktop, OPA service now is up and running. And next step is I need to define my policy, all these roles and permissions in a Rego file. And also I can upload this Rego file to the OPA service by accessing its localhost 8181 port, and I can also put this policies file to the let's say RBAC example storage. As you can see in this below configuration, I am creating user roles table with 2 roles and the users like Yak and Vobur, one is speaker and another admin. This information is sent by the APISIX, such as Yak speaker information, to OPA, and then I can also extract the username from OPA rego file. As you can see, from input I can get a consumer and I can get a username. In my case, username can be Yak or Babur. Next is, as you can see, I'm also creating a map role to speaker permissions or admin permissions, whereas speakers can only read, admins can read and write. Also, I am getting from the JWT token, I am also getting the permissions, role permissions here. As you can see from the payload, we are first decoding this bearer token, and then from the bearer token we're extracting the payload. From the payload I can collect the permission, and I'm comparing if the given role and the permission, if it's matched to permission in the JWT payload. I think this OPA configuration is quite simple, and as you can see, all these occupied with the allow the body, because we are only allowing if user has a proper role and permission to access our API endpoint. I will copy this command and put it in terminal. If I do so, OPA service responds OK, which means now I have registered my policy. From now on, our OPA service working, it has a policy, but the next and final step is to update our existing plugin config to use OPA service, and we need to introduce OPA plugin of APISIX. As you can see, I'm specifying the host where my OPA service is running, and I'm also referring to the policy name, and we are also enabling with consumer information. True means APISIX will send the consumer data, all the consumer related data to OPA service. So let me update this plugin config with OPA plugin now enabled. If I do so, APISIX says OK, and now I can try to validate if this setup is working fine. To test this, we can run the same crawl command against API gateway endpoint / topics with authorization and JWT token in the header. If I click and run, I will get the same response now forwarded to the conference API, and from conference API we are getting the response via API gateway. But here what's changed actually, API gateway first checks JWT token as an authentication process, and then it sends the consumer and JWT token data to OPA service, right? And to verify if the role and the permissions as authorization process are matching. Any request without JWT token in place, or maybe allowed roles or permissions, will be denied. We can test like by removing speaker's permission, let's say read permission from the OPA policy rego file, and update this rego file once again by hitting its endpoint, policy endpoint, and then I can try to hit API gateway endpoint with a valid authentication token, but we don't have authorization request enabled. You will get forbidden error immediately from OPA, because this actual user has not valid permission to see speakers topics information. Here are some takeaways from this tutorial. API gateway, as we understood, acts as a centralized point to configure and manage APIs, also API consumers. And OPA open policy agent adds additional authorization layer to define our policies and manage roles and permissions for our APIs. And we can also use APISIX OPA plugin to interact with OPA. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about Apache APISIX, please subscribe to our channel. Click on the bell to receive notifications about new videos.